Hey there, I'm Sharon Welch, and welcome to A Brave Journey, the podcast to help you throw out those legacy belief and identity stories that you've been lugging around on autopilot for decades, so you can jump back in the driver's seat of your aliveness again. When you change your mind, you change your life. Are you ready? Let's get into it. It'll be fun. How many of you have found yourself feeling alone when spending time by yourself? What about in a room full of people that you don't know? What about in a room full of people that you do know? Have you ever felt lonely in a relationship as a parent, a child, a partner, a boss, friend, employee, or a leader? Have you felt lonely when everything's going wrong? Have you felt lonely when everything's going right? Our mental and physical health is directly tied to our level of connectedness. And the fact is, according to some studies, up to 60% of us feel lonely on a regular basis. And I wanted to talk about this today as really sort of a deeper dive or follow on to the conversation we had before about how we hide from each other, about how we create this chasm between where we really are, where we want people to think that we are, and that hiding that happens in between because we're afraid if we're found out that we'll be rejected and be lonely anyway. So it almost seems like a no-win, right? So we're wired in this way that we need that sense of belonging and emotional and physical safety. So this is largely why we create these facades to create a version of ourselves that in our minds, keep in mind we've made all this up. In our minds, we've created this persona, we've created this version of ourselves that would be acceptable, that would be granted the privilege or favor of being protected, of being safe, of being loved. And unfortunately, as we do that, every layer that we put over our unvarnished, authentic selves just increases that gap of loneliness. Now, loneliness and those feelings of isolation can be either externally or internally driven. But regardless, when they're left unattended, they can have devastating effects. And I want to talk a little bit about that. There was this interview with Laurie Santos, who is a cognitive science and psychology professor at Yale. She has a class called Psychology and the Good Life, and it is one of the most popular on campus. And it eventually led her to start a podcast called The Happiness Lab. If you haven't heard it, highly recommend you check it out. She says, again, that there are some surveys that suggest up to 60% of people in the US report feeling lonely on a regular basis. That is a worse percentage than people who suffer from obesity or diabetes, 60%. So these numbers have been steadily rising since the 1970s. So it's not like we can make a knee-jerk reaction and blame cell phones or social media. However, we seemingly have less time or more distractions to fill our time. So we have less time available to create these meaningful human connections. We zone out to the TV or Netflix after a hard day at work. We bring work home. We do scroll social media or the news, or we have a stack of books on our bedside table that we, quote, should be reading. We have soccer games and fundraisers and household chores that we squeeze into our non-working hours, often just to, quote, keep up with the Joneses. So whether we want to paint social media and our phones or screen time as the culprit, there are an increasingly number of things that distract us in our lives, an increasingly large list of things that we are supposedly responsible for, have to juggle, have to manage to have, again, this made up idea of the successful life. So all of these things that are happening externally that I just mentioned. And all of these things that we are doing to ourselves, these facades, these masks that we're creating to hide ourselves inside, this loneliness, this isolation that we're creating affects our health. It can be a contributor to dementia, to heart disease, to stroke. It also affects our longevity. The health effect of loneliness has been equated to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of its impact to our well being. Think about that for a minute. You could just be leading the healthiest life you can imagine, going to the gym or yoga or meditating or taking a walk out in the fresh air every day and eating healthy foods. And if you are in this cycle where these internal and external factors are affecting your level of isolation and loneliness, you may as well be smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Wow. There's another consumer survey that came out in June of 2023 that says that more than a third of US adults say that they are alone or don't interact with others at least once a week. And 41% of people say that a lack of friends or community drives their loneliness. What's interesting is that it is the younger Gen Z millennials who feel the most alone, with boomers feeling the least alone. It's only a few percentage points. However, the difference is somewhat striking. And higher income Americans are more lonely than lower income. So, what we see happening is in a world that is increasingly becoming more and more complex, and in a world where we are increasingly exposed to things to compare ourselves against because of things like widespread television or social media or digital connectedness. We have more ways to artificially measure ourselves. As younger people are coming of age and becoming adults in this increasingly complex world, they are feeling the brunt of this chasm of isolation and loneliness. Boomers, older adults, they at some point had the benefit of a simpler life. And while I think we all collectively feel some of these bouts of loneliness and isolation, I think it's just important to look at the fact that as our world continues to become more and more digitally connected and more complex, these are the types of things that we need to help the people who are younger than us navigate. Now, some part of this, as I talked about, digital media can be, I guess, blamed for some of that loneliness. According to the studies, we spend about 50% of our time digitally connected to something. But that range is really at the high end at 73% of Gen Z compared down to 40% of boomers. That's still a lot of time spending online, scrolling, judging ourselves, not having the time or seeming to have the time to create actual meaningful connections and community. The innate understanding of our need for connectedness and community certainly goes back much further than this. In the ancient concept of ikigai in Japan, belonging and surrounding yourself with friends and community is a key component for living a balanced, content, and full life. Now, caveat here, the concept of ikigai has become quite popular in recent years and has, I'll say, been hijacked by corporate types as a map to finding your quote purpose, which in their use means what job should you do based on what you love, what others value, and what you could make money doing. What is that intersection? But honestly, this is an incomplete and frankly irresponsible application of the holistic Japanese concept for a life well lived. So, as an aside, I would urge you to seek the deeper, more authentic concept if you run off to the Google machine to find out more about ikigai. So, my point in all this is that if you are listening to this right now, likely you have definitely experienced loneliness or isolation. And for many of us, you feel it on the regular, if not all the time. And unfortunately, this just adds to this messy soup of this self imposed prison that we put on ourselves as we try to navigate our lives and come out the other side, whatever that looks like, somewhat unscathed. Being alone does not necessarily equate loneliness. I want to make that distinction, of course. For me, my alone time, I travel alone, I live alone. I do a lot of things on my own, and I'm quite happy to do so, and I'm sure many of you are as well. So, in those times when I'm alone, it's not often that I necessarily feel lonely. Lonely, for me, when I experience it, is when I don't feel that connection to other humans. I can feel connection to other humans observing them in the park while people watching. So it's not even not having my people around me physically necessarily. It's just really that feeling of I'm truly by myself. Either nobody understands me, nobody gets me, or I don't have someone to share an experience with or to bounce an idea off of. Maybe I'm bored. Maybe that leads to some loneliness once in a while. But I do want to make the distinction that being alone does not necessarily mean lonely. All of this to say, as we were talking about before, we've created this self imposed prison around ourselves where we hesitate to show our authentic self for fear of being ostracized and being on the outside and not having people like us and want to connect with us. And so that prevents us from growing in abundance and joy in our lives, which maybe makes us feel sad or a sense of dis-ease, makes us feel uncomfortable. And we talked about the paradox of wanting that connection, wanting people to recognize our uniqueness, our authenticity, but not being able to show it because we're afraid that we won't get that validation, that recognition of our true selves. So here we sit in this vicious cycle, wondering why we can't experience the maximum amount of joy, why we can't experience the maximum amount of abundance. It's interesting, right? I think one of the hardest parts of dropping those facades, one of the hardest parts of just really living unapologetically your authentic life, it is this issue of being the other, of not belonging, of being lonely, of being not understood. And, our brains, our egos, which, as incessant as their nonsense is, this internal dialogue, those aspects of ourselves really do have our best interests at heart, so to speak. But when that safety mechanism kicks in, what ends up happening is we do exactly the things that are going to pull us further and further from connection and community. And that's going to pull us further and further from our authentic selves and our truth. Sort of another paradox, I guess. Maybe one of the themes here is we really have to get comfortable with paradox everywhere in our world. Sometimes conflicting things are both true and it doesn't make any sense, and that's okay. So if loneliness is one more aspect of how we end up scuttling our efforts to live authentic lives, what do we do about it? Well, you know what I'm going to say. Like we talked about before, you have to, somewhere inside yourself, find that glimmer of bravery to take one small vulnerable step to being open to those connections, to be open to being a part of a community, making connections with other humans, and taking part fully in community is not always a bed of roses. There are, adjustments that have to happen. There is not only a sense of vulnerability for what you must expose and contribute to the collective, but what you will receive from others who are doing the same. And that can feel scary. It can feel like a bother. It can feel like a lot of effort. And so, because it sometimes seems hard, we just opt out of doing it at all. But then where are we? Taking that step of vulnerability to let others see some aspect of who you really are that they can connect with is the very first thing that starts to open that door to finding that true supportive, enlightening community that we're all looking for. That tribe of people who understand us. They don't have to always agree with us. We're not talking about, monobots who have a group think, who agree on everything. We're talking about finding that community where the people around you get you. They understand you, they celebrate you, your similarities and your differences. And there's no way that can happen without people knowing who you are. And so I know some of us will sit there going, well, crap. I know who I am. I know who I'm trying to be. Boy, if I put that out there, I mean, I'm just I'm just hanging out there. I could fall off that cliff. And yeah, it is going to feel like that. But it's really the only way, if you think about this logically, it's really the only way to find those people. They got to see what it is they're looking for too. And if you keep hiding it, they ain't seeing it. I think for me, this idea of connection and community is something that I have craved my whole life. I have found it here and there, and I have mistakenly thought I found it here and there as well. When I look back through my adult life, mostly, and the tribes of people that I have moved through, I definitely have found connection with people who have and do see who I really am. And I've also recognized upon reflection times when I have been in tribes or groups of people that I thought were that, but really I was just playing a role. I was a caretaker, I was the hero, I was the leader, I was the worshiper, what you want to call it, the follower. I've played those roles as well. And at the time, I didn't think I was. It's only when I look back upon reflection, I see that. So I think my whole adult life, I have been craving, as I evolve as a person, to find that connection and community. In fact, a timely example of that, just recently, you may have heard me mention, I went to a retreat in Tepoztlan, Mexico, where the intention was to do some personal work through all types of modalities, breath work, authentic, or I call it radical relating, meditation, ice plunges, sweat lodges, all kinds of ways to peel back some of those barriers that we put up, even things that we maybe didn't want to or didn't realize were there to admit about ourselves. So I'm not suggesting that the only way to find connection and community is to dive into the deep end like I did, but I think it serves a purpose as an example of what I'm talking about. So over the course of this week that I spent with this group of like minded, really special people at this retreat, we did spend a lot of time practicing vulnerability. We did spend a lot of time chipping away at those untruths, those false things, those protected things about ourselves that we had been carrying the full weight of, often for our whole lives, and sometimes without even knowing it, to really find our way back to ourselves. And for me, find my way into that tribe, that community of people that I could really connect with. It was an interesting experience from another perspective that we were not given a corporate agenda of what was happening throughout the week. Even on a daily basis, it would be pretty unusual for us to know what we were doing the next hour, let alone the next day. And what that served to do was be another vehicle for us to not have preconceived notions, to not worry about the how, to be present in what was going on and to let come whatever was going to come. That prevented a recovering toxic planner like myself from mapping out a desirable or expected outcome and then the 5-year plan that would go along with it. Some of you may be chuckling as you think about what I just said because you know you would have done that too. And so, in that experience of having to, whether through shock to the system or just trying to participate and be present in the retreat, you're really forced to let down some of those barriers. You're really sort of led into a deeper self reflection to be honest first with ourselves. And so, all of the imagining that I did about this, huge monumental shift that was going to come out of my life because of this retreat. All of these things that I thought from a transformation perspective that were on this buffet, on this platter of things that were going to happen to me, I can tell you that the most important, the most transformational thing that came out of that retreat for me was connection and community. And it turns out that is exactly what I needed. So I spent a week really, sometimes painfully, peeling back these layers to be probably the most vulnerable I've ever been. And it's terrifying. I'm just going to put that out there. It's terrifying. The knots in your stomach. I get a little emotional thinking about it right now. As you put that stuff out there, it's not that we were doing that, our first 5 minutes at this retreat. Of course not. You work up to feeling that you're in this safe, protected space where you can be yourself with these people, many of whom at the beginning of the retreat were strangers to me. So over the course of that week, to become so vulnerable and to be raw and to really earnestly put out there at least the beginnings of who I really am and to find a welcoming, accepting, understanding tribe of people was just the most magical thing in the world. I would not trade that experience for anything. And another interesting part of the retreat was we had sort of this, I'll call it an altar. It was sort of a symbolic place where we brought things that represented parts of our lives that we wanted to let go of, as well as something that we wanted to take back with us, infused with, the power and energy of the experience, the collective experience that we all had. And it was fascinating to me that a number of people, myself included, brought items that represented people and maybe situations that we were just had been hanging on to that we were really ready to let go of because they weren't in alignment with our authentic selves, our truth. And we've talked about that before here in this podcast, that it's sort of like, renovating your home. You have to let go of what's taking up space, the old that's there that's no longer working for you, so that you have room for what's new. So the people and situations that I represented through items that I took to this special place to leave there, it really was a process of letting go of the things, the people that were taking up the space that was preventing me from having what I really needed, which was true, authentic connection and community. So it was a surprising, more subtle outcome than anything I could have imagined. But when I say subtle, I in no way am suggesting with lack of power. It's really one of the most powerful experiences in being vulnerable and allowing myself to connect to a community of people. And the things that start to unfold, the inertia of abundance, the inertia of friendship and forward movement in business and in my life began immediately. It's like I cleared the leaves out of the gutter, or we, broke up the dam of the river, or however you want to look at it. But it is so just mind-boggling and so powerful when you can experience what it's like to let your authentic self be seen, and how when that plugs you into that community, that connectedness where you're supposed to be, how much more the rest of your life all of a sudden works more easily, flows more easily. You absolutely must experience it to truly grasp the power of that. So obviously, we're not all going to be able to take a week or 2 weeks out of our lives to go and find ourselves at a retreat. But maybe you are. And if you are, I highly recommend it. Ask me about it. But there are other ways that you can be taking steps towards allowing that vulnerability to lead you to a connected community where you can have your alone without the loneliness. You can find that spot in the world. And it may change over time, and that's okay. But if you're continuing to allow yourself to be vulnerable and open to those connections, those right people are going to recognize you. You're going to recognize them. And that energy right there is what clears the dam. That energy right there is what, connects the circuit, creates the flow. And it's really a magical thing. I don't want to give the advice that says you have to make some grand gesture, or you have to get off of social media, or you have to stop going to your kids' soccer games and fundraisers. That's not what I'm saying. But you also have to make room for yourself in your own life. And you have to make room for the community that wants to support you. And that does require a level of vulnerability. I would be interested to hear from you if you've had that experience of opening the kimono just a little bit that had the positive result of attracting someone or something to your life that was in alignment with who you really are. Because I think it's those little steps that give you the courage to take the next step, and then maybe 3 steps, and then maybe 10 steps in the direction of authenticity and vulnerability. So what are those things? What are those ways that you can test the waters where you still feel relatively safe, but maybe not 100% safe? Because if you're feeling 100% safe, if you're feeling 100% protected, then you know full well that means you're completely blocked off and you're not going to get anywhere. You're still living in a system that wants you right where you are. Ooh, I think we're going to talk about that next time. I think we're going to talk about the systems that we live in and how they're built to keep us right where we are. So think about that while you're brainstorming ideas of how you can find that little sliver of vulnerability to allow your community to find you. Hey, thanks for listening to A Brave Journey. I'm so happy you were here. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and leave a review, and share this with a friend who could benefit too. See you next time.